This man can take 3 guys at once. No, not like that. We start things off with the gunman. He's got some cool gloves and a sniper rifle. He looks like a cold-blooded killer and actually breathes like one. So he's breathing very carefully and scanning the perimeter for a few seconds. And then he begins to pick off targets like this is Call of Duty. 5 victims down, including a woman carrying a child. What a way to set the tone. Anyway, he quickly drives off and the emergency team arrives shortly after. Of course, too late to save the victims and too late to catch the criminal. But of course, not too late to introduce one of the main characters. He has that "I'm gonna get you" look on his face as he scans the perimeter, and before you know it, he finds a bullet casing. That quickly leads them to their killer. Suspected, of course. They raid his house, find him there, find his van too, so they're sure it's him. They bring him in handcuffs and that's it. Case solved, mission successful, roll credits. But of course, Hollywood just likes to make our lives more complicated, so the detective who brought him in is questioning him and trying to get him to confess in front of the DA. Okay, he looks like he's about to write a confession. Roll credits again? Psych, it's only the beginning, because he wrote, "Get Jack Reacher," in all caps, which is the name of the movie. I know exactly what you're about to ask, but the detective beats you to it. Who in the heckaroni is Jack Reacher? He goes on to answer his own question, telling us Jack Reacher is a ghost. No phone number, no email, no credit card, no maidens, nothing. He's ex-military though. While he's talking, we see Jack Reacher, and when the face of the bad guy pops up on CNN, we see Jack show interest. While all his achievements are still being read by Mr. Detective, Jack goes shopping. We follow him to the changing room and we see his scars. He comes out, pays for the new clothes, and dumps the old ones. Meanwhile, Mr. Detective has cracked his case a little bit. Jack is in the US and periodically withdraws his pension from a woman who is making passes at him. But he can't find him because there's no warrant, and apparently Jack is clean. No, not because he threw all his old clothes away, because there's nothing on his record. Focus please. So the DA then asks how they can find Jack, and Mr. Detective says, obviously you don't find this guy unless he wants to be found. And you won't believe what happens next. A knock on the door. The DA's secretary comes in to say, "There's a Jack Reacher here to see you." Man, who would have thought? Honestly, everyone. Come on now. Anyway, Jack walks in and when the DA asks, "Can I help you?" all he said was, "James Barr." And we found ourselves in a room with the 3 men looking over a badly brutalized man on a hospital bed. It so happens that that's our sniper guy after he was roughed up by his fellow inmates and now he's in a coma. And it's even worse than the ones you get after eating carbs. Anyway, Jack refuses to say why sniper guy asked for him by name, and then a woman named Helen Roden walks in confronting the men. Apparently, she's sniper guy's attorney, and more interestingly, the DA's daughter. So there's a little bit of a family feud here. Somebody call Steve Harvey. Jack Reacher still doesn't tell us much about why sniper guy called him. He just tells us he's not friends with him, and he's not here to help him. He's there to bury him. Okay. Next scene, quick money exchange. You can taste the illegality in the air, by the way. And then that question again, who the heck is Jack Reacher? Of course, they leave that hanging there and cut to Jack and Helen, who now has a tape recorder recording their conversation. Jack brags a little, declares sniper guy guilty, and accuses Helen of taking the case of an obviously guilty man because of daddy issues. Woman moment. Helen asks how he could label him guilty without seeing the evidence, and Jack said simply that some people join the military just so they can legally clap people, and sniper guy was one of those guys. Okay, I gotta cut it with the nickname. His real name is James Barr. Anyway, although James trained for years, he never scored a kill. Me, in video games. He was sent to the battlegrounds and wasn't cleared to fire a single shot for 2 years, even though he was watching through the eye of his sniper day in, day out. He had shot 250,000 rounds in his career, but none of them had been at a human target. Truly tragic. He really wanted to scratch that itch, so he took his pistol and shot at 4 random civilian contractors. Afterwards, he covered his tracks well, but not too well for Jack Reacher. Jack confronted him and he confessed, but it so happened that the guys James shot were the scum of the earth, very bad men who were committed of very bad crimes. You know what? Fair game. Those guys got what they deserved, so James went free. Can't argue with that. But Jack promised James that if he ever did something like that again, he would find him and make sure he doesn't go free again. And that was exactly what he was here for. Anyway, Helen still manages to convince Jack to see the evidence first after a pretty compelling speech. So he agreed on the condition that she looks at the victims objectively. So she basically had to go knocking on the doors of the families of the victims. And of course, she had to introduce herself as the attorney defending the man who clapped their people. I personally would have just slammed the door in her face. But this man right here is a better man than me. He invited her into his home and had a conversation with her. Perhaps he's hoping to clap. Suddenly, the man threatens the lawyer with a revolver. Not that kind of clapping, but she managed to run to her car fast enough where her father came and startled her. By the way, we find out that the man she went to visit is the father of the woman with the baby. You remember, right? Well, the woman was a nanny to the baby, and the baby survived. Baby Pog. Anyway, family feud continues in the car when daddy tells daughter she can't win the case and it would only ruin her career. Daughter gets angry, shouts, and drives away. Next thing, Mr. Detective links up with Jack and we find out James paid for parking. Why? Mr. Detective thinks he was just stupid or it was just simple muscle memory. Jack doesn't think so. He's still pondering upon it at a bar later that night when a young lady named Sandy approaches him trying to get to know him. Jack gives her a very obviously fake name, but it doesn't seem to matter to her, as she still has the hots for Jimmy Reese. But Jack, or Jimmy, doesn't want to use his Jimmy tonight. He says he couldn't afford her. She takes offense to the statement. She says she's not that type of girl. And he says, well then I really can't afford you. Based. Next thing you know, some guys who called themselves her brothers came together and challenged him to a fight outside. 1v5, that isn't fair. For them. Jack hits them with the, call an ambulance, but not for me. He beats up all 5 of them and then the police came and took him into custody. It was clearly self-defense. Mr. Detective and Helen get him out of jail, and Jack explains to Helen what he's currently working with. His theory about the girl and her so-called brothers being sent to take him out. Not on a date, obviously, you dummy. After they left the station, Helen shared what she gathered about the victims with Jack. Really touching stories, I tell you. But as an alpha male, Jack quickly dissected the story and it didn't seem as touching anymore. At least for 2 of the victims. Perhaps they even deserved it. Oh, by the way, some pretty interesting tension is building between Helen and Jack. We'll have to see what becomes of that. Now remember those guys whose illegality we could smell much earlier? Yeah, they're back. Now they know who Jack Reacher is and even have a file on him. And we find out that they were the ones who sent those guys who got their butts beat at the bar. But obviously, Jack Reacher is still alive. And you know how those bad guys are doing. Someone has to go down for the mess up. So, some creepy old dude who, according to him, chewed his own fingers off to survive in Siberia, asked the guy who was paid to do the job to chew off his own fingers. Do I need to say it? Of course, he couldn't do it. Beta. So boom, he was stopped from living. Back to Jack and Helen, they're still trying to solve the case when Jack decided to go pay Sandy, the girl from the bar, a visit at the auto parts store she works at. The moment she sets eyes on Jack, she was so frightened that she immediately started ratting all the guys out. According to Sandy, it was all Jeb's idea. Jeb also worked at the auto parts store as a cover-up for his, Breaking Bad business. She even gave him Jeb's address and the keys to his car, and Jack didn't even have to lift a finger. Sandy just didn't want any of that smoke. Anyway, Jack drives to Jeb's house in Jeb's car, but only an elderly woman is home. She sneakily pressed a button on a phone, and a few minutes later, 2 guys sneak up on Jack and one hits him in the back of the head with a baseball bat. They then make some pretty ridiculous attempts at an attack that the thieves from Home Alone would be proud of. Easiest fight Jack Reacher ever won. Suddenly, an extra guy came with a carbine and Jack took care of him easily. None of those guys was Jeb though. I'll save you the suspense. Jeb was put to sleep forever by the guy that hired him to take care of Jack. Yes, the same one with the finger chewing and whatever. Alright, you get it. Anyway, back to Jack and Helen trying to crack the case. The new theory is that James probably wanted to get caught, and Jack's new conclusion is that James is actually innocent. Now, even Helen, the woman defending James, doesn't believe him. How the turntables turned, or whatever Michael Scott said, right? Meanwhile, sussy guys have been following Jack. He figured it out and asked Helen to run the plates, and somehow, sussy guys were alerted. Someone on the inside maybe. Anyway, the check on the plates popped up a certain company name, Leben Dower Enterprises, and that was enough to help Helen figure it out. The bad guys had 4 random people taken out to cover up the murder of one. Apparently this lady, Miss Archer, had a construction business which someone else wanted and was ready to kill for. Talk about a killer business. At this point, Jack is trying to convince Helen to not only fight for James, but also find the actual guys who did it. But she's not very interested in saving the world. Anyway, the bad guys catch up to Sandy and delete her. And Mr. Detective seems to think Jack is the suspect, and next thing we know, car chase. This movie would not have been complete without one. While the cops are chasing Jack, Jack is chasing the guys who actually did the crime. The chase is frantic, exhilarating, and you know, all those other colorful words better writers would use. I don't have time for that. I'm trying to put out 1 video a day here, guys. Come on. It ends with a beautiful scene to restore our faith in humanity. Jack gets out of his car and joins a group of strangers at the bus stop, and they all voluntarily help hide him from the police. Very cool. He then gets on a bus and loses the cops completely. Mr. Detective and Mr. DA then go to Helen to try and find out where Jack is or how to find him. And what do you think? Of course, Family Feud yet again. Good answer. Then Jack calls and tells her that either her dad or Mr. Detective is in on the whole thing, and he makes her see reason. Mansplaining moment. She obviously starts looking at Mr. Detective differently. I mean, it can't be her own father for sure. Anyhow, the next day, Jack goes to the gun range he thinks James practiced at and tries to get some information from the man in charge. The man tells Jack that if he can hit the center of the target 3 times, then they can talk. First one goes wide, but the next 3, spot on. So the man in charge tells Jack about James and a friend he used to come with to the gun range. Jack quickly calls Helen and updates her with his findings, but she's in a conversation with her dad and can't talk. It was during that conversation that she realized that it was her father, not Mr. Detective, that was in on it all along. Talk about daddy issues. So she walks out of his office and gets into the elevator. While she's in there, we're hit with one of Hollywood's favorite tropes. The elevator was just about to close shut and then a hand stops it. It was the hand of the detective. But no reason to fret. He's innocent. It's her father who was working with the bad guys all along, right? Definitely not. She notices him making a suspicious move and quickly tries to reach for the elevator buttons. But he tases her and she becomes unconscious. And boom, it's the usual suspects who come to retrieve her from the elevator. So, what did we learn, kids? Never judge a book by its cover, I guess. But here's the thing. Helen is small fish. It's Jack they really want. So, this is a hostage situation. All the bad guys in a room with the girl. I've seen this one before. Then, Jack calls. They do the normal good guy, bad guy back and forth, and they end up providing Jack with an address. This time though, Jack the loner did not go alone. He asked the man in charge of that gun range that James practiced at for help, and he seemed excited to join Jack on the adventure. What a complete and utter work of fiction. And you know what came next? Of course you do. A shootout. Could this movie really be complete without a gunfight? Yes, I know I said the same thing about the car race, but two things can be true at the same time, you know? Like, actually I forgot to write a punchline. Anyway, the gunfight is 2 versus 3, and Jack takes out 2 of the bad guys with the help of his sniper friend. And like with every action movie, it all leads up to the main good guy versus the main bad guy face-off. I personally think it was great that they showed that Jack could be stupid too. He had a gun to this guy's head, and instead of just pulling the trigger, he threw his gun aside and started a fist fight instead. Just Sigma male things. And you can trust the bad guy to not fight fair. He brought a knife, but do I have to say it? Jack still put a beating on him. Even my dad would be jealous. Oh, and by the way, it's raining heavily at this point as you can see. You know nothing makes a dirty fight dirtier than mud. So Jack moves to the room where only Mr. Detective, Helen, and Old Dude are now left. And with some insane shooting technique, he takes out Mr. Detective. What's next? Creepy old finger guy. Jack first considered handing him over to the police, but on second thought, he decided to hand him over to God instead. And now with all that wrapped up, they go back to their various lives. Helen is back defending James. He's awake from his coma now and she goes to visit him. And it so happens that he remembers absolutely nothing from the incident. But he remembers a certain guy from his past. A guy who doesn't care about the law or proof, only about what's right. A guy who knows him and something he did in the past and made a promise that if he, James, ever got in trouble again, he'd be there. But from the look of things, right now, he's somewhere else trying to get a helpless woman some good old fist justice. Gotta love the lad. Oh, and by the way, nothing eventually happened between Jack and Helen. That's a first, and a shame. But there's a sequel, and this is Hollywood, so never say never. Moral of the story?